So I will start at this moment by sharing the source sheet, by sharing my screen, and I'll put into the chat one more time the source sheet. And those of you who have learned with me before know that I kind of look up at my second monitor to see the source sheet kind of enlarged on my screen. So you'll forgive the upward look and balancing that between looking at you also. So I'm going to go ahead and go to page 1 here. Today, what we'll do together is talk a little bit at first about what Kohelet is, and also what Sukkot is. Happy Sukkot, Chag Sameach, Moadim L'Simcha, all the Sukkot greetings. So we'll talk a little bit about Kohelet and Sukkot, because I want us to begin to think about not only the meanings that we can glean from Kohelet, but the fact that traditionally speaking, we read it on Sukkot. I want us to explore connections between the two of those things and think about what additional or expanded meaning we can make with that connection. So we'll, in addition to doing a little bit of an intro to those things, we'll look at some texts in Kohelet and we'll do some reading aloud, some texts that are a little bit difficult. And then I think we'll shift gears to some perhaps more inspiring texts, and then we'll try and bring it all together toward the end of our time today. So on page 1, you can see a table that begins to share with us a little bit about what Kohelet is. It's a 12-chapter book in the writings section of the Hebrew Bible, the third of the 3 sections. And it has various reflections, aphorisms that do seem, for the most part, to express a hopelessness, but also there are some other kinds of reflections there, and we'll look at all of those. You might be wondering, or some of you might be wondering, well, where and when was this book written? We don't know a tremendous amount about, factually speaking, but there are a few things that I can share with you. The traditional view is that King Solomon wrote this book, wrote these words. That's not likely, given that the book has linguistic implications, linguistic indications that it's a late book. Some scholars date the book to the 300s BCE. Some go even further and date it to the 200s BCE. We don't know for sure. The book was sort of assigned to Sukkot beginning in about the year 1000. We have evidence of it beginning with the medieval period. So there are a few connections. And before we talk about those, I'm going to scroll down and I'll begin to share my screen now to page 3. And we'll go back and forth between some of the pages. So let me go ahead and share my screen so I can show you where I am. Okay, bear with me. I want to pause for a moment, and maybe Mara will edit this out. I want to just make sure there's a car alarm going. I have my windows open, and I want to make sure you can hear me clearly. Can people give a thumbs up if they can hear me clearly? Okay, thank you. So table 3 on page 5 tells us a little bit about Sukkot. You might already know that Sukkot is the final harvest festival of the year. It's a holiday of ingathering. Sometimes people have compared Sukkot to the Jewish Thanksgiving. It is considered in the Torah the season of our joy, and we are told in the Torah that we should be utterly joyous. There are booths in the, you might know, Sukkot literally means booths. And if you walk around many different areas of the world where Jews live, you may see booths outside. And in the Torah, the booths have a little bit of a different origin than we might have learned already. It seems like when people took their harvests in, they went out to the fields for, days, weeks in a row, and they slept out there. People slept out in the fields to do their harvests, and they created these booths in order to protect themselves while they were sleeping and to actually live there temporarily. And as you may already know, the booths, the Sukkot, are also associated with the Israelites in the desert and God protecting the Israelites in their journey. So I want us to just keep all that in mind as we think about the connections between Kohelet and Sukkot. And I know that was a lot, but we'll do our best to hold on to both the meanings of Sukkot and also the things that we discover in Kohelet. So here are some suggestions about the reading of Kohelet on Sukkot. One of them is that in the same way that Sukkot is a harvest festival, a festival of ingathering, a time of year after Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot, but one might say it's still a reflective time of year. You might say that. So in the same way, Kohelet has reflections and is an ingathering, a harvest of ideas. Also, the sukkah itself signifies the temporary nature of life, and we'll see that is a major theme in Kohelet. And one author, David Kerwin, who just published a book on Kohelet within the past year, he talks about the joy on Sukkot being balanced with perhaps the darkness of Kohelet. And the rabbis who said that we should read the book wanted us to have a little bit more of a balance than just the utter and complete joy that we may experience on Sukkot. And another scholar, Michael Fox, says, listen, all the other holidays had a Megillah, a scroll assigned to them. The rabbis wanted a time to read Kohelet also. So I share all of these with you as possible connections, and we'll come back most likely at the very end to see what makes the most sense as we explore Kohelet today. Okay, so one more overview piece, and then I'll pause. This is a table of both things in Kohelet that are generally negative or generally positive, or things that can be experienced as both. So Kohelet talks a lot about foolishness. He talks about old age and death. He talks about how if we amass property and wealth, it doesn't always stay, certainly it doesn't stay with us when we die, but it may not stay in our family because even if we pass along an inheritance, it may not be used properly. So even if we achieve wealth, it may dissipate and disappear. And he also talks a lot about how there really is the problem of theodicy. There's really no clear pattern of reward and punishment in the world based on this guy Kohelet's experience. And those are clearly difficult and negative things. Shifting to the column labeled number 3, there are antidotes to that. Being in the present, enjoying a partner. Kohelet says 2 are better than 1, seemingly in connection to both friendship and romantic relationships. He talks about enjoying our youth. And even though those of us who are wise, and those of us who are foolish end up in the same place, we all die, it's still better to be wise. And there are verses throughout about fearing God. And you can see there, you can take a look at some of the things in the middle also. But we are going to take a look at both those difficult negative things, those things that seem positive, and try and make sense of the conflicts. So let me shift to what I wrote for us to think about today. I've already shared a little bit. What is the content of the book? I want us to go through significant passages in the book. What is the content? What are the conflicts in the book? What meanings can we derive from the book in connection to Sukkot? And in particular, the refrain repeated throughout Kohelet. I'll say in Hebrew first, and then we'll talk about how to translate that. Havel havalim, havel havalim. When we say the word in singular and it's not at the end of a sentence, we say havel. It's sort of very hard. It's hard for me to always remember how to say it correctly, but hevel, I'll translate in a moment, or havel, havalim is a refrain repeated throughout. And I want us to pay close attention to that also. I will, in a moment, you can certainly do it on your own, but in a moment, I want us to look at some possible translations for that phrase or that word. But I do want to pause and see if there are any initial questions or reflections. We'll take 1, 2, or 3. And if not, that's okay. But we'll pause here before we dive into some definitions, translations, and some text.
So Abby, in the chat, I think that people are mostly just excited about what the word mean, what like Kohelet actually means, which it sounds like you're getting there. But other than that, we are not seeing too many questions. But if anyone wants to raise their hand, now's the time. Shelly asks, what's the difference between neshama and havel?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So neshama, to say it in Ashkenazic Hebrew, is generally translated as soul. And Kohelet really doesn't address the soul of a person. In the Torah in general, another word for soul is nephesh, that we use as soul, but actually the Hebrew Bible, for the most part, doesn't really have a sense of soul as separate from body. And so the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, is generally focused on the physical life that we have in this world and the experience of that, but not so much, there really is no word for soul in the Hebrew Bible. Neshama is generally used more so in rabbinic Hebrew, and also can mean breath, but it's not used in Kohelet at all, unless I'm mistaken, but I don't believe it's used in Kohelet at all. So I can look into that more if Shelly wants to email me. I can see what I can find at Abby@ExploreJewish. So let's talk about havel or havel, havalim. There are quite a few translations. So based on the King James Bible, I believe in the 1600s or 1500s, we used to translate havel as vanity, or the phrase havel havalim as vanity of vanities. That alludes to the efforts that we make in vain. I mentioned pursuing wealth. Not only the efforts in vain, and let me just clarify, I mentioned pursuing wealth, but not being able to hold on to the wealth, either for ourselves or for our descendants. There also, Kohelet talks about really human beings not being able to understand clearly patterns in the world. And he talks about how we're just incapable of making sense of things. And that too, so our efforts to pursue wisdom, which he talks about quite a bit, are in vain. However, I would say in the last 50 years or so, that word has been taken to task, and there are other definitions that I would suggest are better. So for example, the Jewish Study Bible, based on the Jewish Publication Society, translates havel as futility. And we'll just read this first paragraph together, and then we'll move to some other definitions and translations. So text 4 says, for Kohelet, this, havel or futility, is foremost the inability of humans to make sense of the world around them, to see a coherent pattern, or to see a plan to their lives and to nature, in the sense of movement toward lasting goals, or a line or development or progress. So that's a mouthful, that's a lot. But the idea is not only can we simply not make sense of things around us, but when we try and more logically and more deeply recognize patterns, and patterns that are specific toward goals, it's very difficult to do that. That's one definition. Robert Alter, a little bit later, notes that havel in the Hebrew Bible, and this is a beautiful image, compares it to, he says that Hevel is probably something like when we breathe in the wintertime, if you live in a cold climate, and we can see the vapor, our breath, and then it disappears. That's the image that he suggests that we should be thinking of for Hevel, breath. He, in the end, Robert Alter translates Hevel as mere breath, and you'll see that throughout my translations below. One scholar and friend and colleague, Tzemach Yora, I wrote it here as TY, and I'll just write it out. He actually essentially has convinced me that it's not mere breath, because that's too negative, as we'll see. It really seems to be breath. And I would say even more, not only is the best way to translate Hevel literally as breath, but more so literarily, I would suggest it's fleeting. And sometimes JPS does translate, Jewish Publication Society, does translate Hevel as fleeting. Not all the time, though. So I think for the most part, and you'll see why, we'll be exploring these texts together, why Hevel, for the most part, it makes sense to think of it as a state of being that's temporary or fleeting, or simply in the way our breath is fleeting from one breath to the next. Hevel is also, Hevel is considered breath in its, or fleeting, something fleeting in its most, in its, I'm suggesting is the best translation. I apologize, I was distracted. Somebody is knocking at my door, which I'm not gonna answer right now. So those are some possible translations. You'll see also that one translation here is, Michael Fox says, futility or absurdity are some possibilities, and they also include vanity, insubstantiality, elusiveness, and ephemerality. Those are all possibilities, but as we go through, I'll ask you to keep in mind for yourself, what do you think is the best possible translation? So we will shift now to some of the texts and begin to look at what is the content of the book of Kohelet, both difficult and negative, and maybe not as much. And let's see what the translations, which translations fit best. So I'm going to invite someone, one of our learners today, one of you, to read this first passage here, 11 verses. When you read, you can skip the verse numbers. You can choose whether or not you want to read JPS or Alter, and you can skip what I wrote in red. We'll come back to that. So can I ask anyone to get us started today with our text analysis, text number 7 on page 9. Just reading. Okay, great. I see a hand. Noreen, thank you so much. So Noreen, you can keep your hands up so we can see you, and you can unmute.
I'm actually, I'm seeing Dr. Irene's hand. I'm not seeing Noreen.
Oh, so I saw Noreen's actual physical hand. So okay. We could unmute Noreen, and then maybe Irene can read another time.
Noreen.
Okay, wonderful.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
The words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Havel, Havelim, utter futility, said Kohelet, utter futility, all is futile. What real value is there for a man in all the gains he makes beneath the sun? One generation goes, another comes, but the earth remains the same forever. Wealth dissipates. The sun rises and the sun sets and glides back to where it rises. Southward blowing, turning northward, ever turning blows the wind. On its rounds, the wind returns. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place from which they flow, the streams flow back again. All things are wearisome. No man can ever state them. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear enough of hearing. Only that shall happen which has happened. Only that occur which has occurred. There's nothing new beneath the sun. Sometimes there's a phenomenon of which they say, look, this one is new. It occurred long since in ages that went by before us. The earlier ones are not remembered. So too, those that will occur later will no more be remembered. Then those that will occur at the very end, no legacy. We all die and may only have a legacy for a something generation.
Oh, for a couple generations.
Couple generation. Okay.
Sorry about that. Okay. Thank you so much, Noreen. Okay, great. So this is the beginning of the book. Chapter 1 really serves as an introduction and a good summary for what Kohelet considers Hevel, or Havel. And let's take a look at the pieces in red here, which I added so that we could glean easily some of the key ideas here. So in verse 4, Kohelet says, one generation goes, another comes, the earth is what remains forever. And for those Hebrew speakers here, I want to point out, Dor holech, the Dor ba, v'ha'aretz la'olam omedet. Very beautiful Hebrew. One generation comes, another goes. Going back to verse 3, there's a connection here. I'm making a connection, which others before me do also. There's really, it doesn't matter what I gain. I'm gonna die, and whatever I gain does not remain with me when I die. Kohelet spends some time talking about nature, and perhaps even nature's cycles don't seem purposeful, but on the other hand, maybe he says that's the only lasting thing. He says there's nothing new under the sun. He says that when we die, so, we're pretty focused on death here, we have no legacy. Most of us are not remembered after a few generations, after our descendants are able to talk about us for briefly for a couple generations. Most of us are not remembered past a few generations. And I'll add one more piece here, which is worth showing you. The end of the chapter also has something poignant about what it is that is Havel, Hevel. And in English, in verse 15, Kohelet says, a twisted thing cannot be made straight, a lack cannot be made good. Meaning, as Robert Alter summarizes beautifully, when we make an error, that can be irreparable. When we harm a relationship, or we get in our own way, not only are events that happen irreversible, but things that go wrong, we cannot correct them. We can, the whole repentance process, of course, that we're coming off of, allows us to start anew, but we certainly can't go back when we make an error or a serious error. So that's what we have so far. Let's do a little bit more reading, and then we'll pause for some more questions. So you'll see here in verse 10, I want to just summarize what comes before then, and then I'm going to read verses 10 and 11 out loud. Kohelet talks about, you can see verses 4, 5, 6, he created a tremendous amount of wealth for himself. In verse 8, he amasses silver and gold. He says he was wealthier than anyone else in Jerusalem. And in addition, his wisdom, his pursuit of wisdom remained with him too. And in verse 10, I withheld from my eyes nothing they asked for and denied myself no enjoyment. Rather, I did get enjoyment out of all my wealth, and that was all I got out of my wealth. Then my thoughts turned to all the fortune my hands had built up, to the wealth I had acquired and won. And oh, it was futile and pursuit of wind. There was no real value under the sun. Hakol havel ureut ruach ve'ein yitron tachat hashemesh. He goes on here and in many other places. Again, it's futile, futile, whatever wealth I might amass, I can't hold on to it in the end. And he also talks about, I added a couple of other things. Again, this connection between wisdom and folly, it's better to pursue a life of wisdom, he says later in the chapter, but the same fate awaits all of us. And I'm gonna keep going and point out some of the difficult things here. In verses 10 and 11, Kohelet says, And so I have seen the wicked brought to the grave, and from a holy place they went forth, while those who did right were forgotten in the town. This too is mere breath. The sentence for an evil act is not carried out swiftly. Therefore, the heart of the sons of men brims over within them to do evil. It's easy for us to do what's wrong because there are no quick, swift, clear consequences. Verse 12, Kohelet takes a little bit of a different stance. Some scholars consider this an edit added later, but we don't know definitively. For the offender does evil 100-fold and lives a long life, though I know too that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear his presence, and it will not be well with the scoundrel, and he will not live long because he does not revere God. So we have a conflict here, which Michael Fox talks about. Yes, throughout the book of Kohelet, there are quite a few contradictions and conflicts. This is a perfect example. Kohelet, on the one hand, says, I can't make sense of who's rewarded, who's punished. And on the other hand, a couple verses into that discussion, wait a second, no, there is hope for that the offender, the person who does something wrong, will face consequences. So all of that, though, verse 14 really seems to point to the verses that come before. No reward and punishment. That's also something that we struggle with. So there's a lot here, things that are difficult when we walk through the world, look out at our experience. I don't think Kohelet is saying anything that may come as a shock to us. He's certainly in beautiful language highlighting those things. So let me pause here. And again, I want to throw out there, what do you make of all these difficult or disturbing things? And especially in connection to Sukkot, which is supposed to be, in our tradition, in Jewish tradition, a holiday of joy. So we'll pause here and then we'll continue to see that perhaps everything isn't so bad, but I would be interested, I'm curious to hear where people are landing with these difficult ideas. So I see Dr. Irene Lancaster's hand. Dr. Lancaster, if you want to go ahead and unmute, if you have a question. I know you wanted to read earlier, but let's start with you.
Yes, hi, I'm trying to show you, I'm from England.
Welcome.
First of all, just to let you know, first of all, I really enjoyed the fact that you're translating Hevel in all different ways, which is excellent. Secondly, what I think is this, that, you've got all the lulav and etrog and hadass and, all the 4 species that you're supposed to take with you and shake, and also the guests that you invite. And you're not supposed to differentiate. And because it's at the end of the Jewish year, we're going to start a new year soon, reading Bereshit. I think it's to do with the fact that it doesn't really matter whether a person's rich, poor, successful or not, because at the end, we're all in the same sukkah, which depends on God. I know that's not just necessarily what you read, but that's what I think. I've just written an article about Sukkot for a website, and this is what I think, that everything is fleeting and doesn't last. And that's what the sukkah is about, especially in my country. It's raining all the time. It was really boiling in Israel. And then it rained as soon, apparently, in Sfat in northern Israel. I don't know where you're based, in New York or something. But it was raining, and, it was written for a very hot country, really. And, they live out. But basically, it's to do that we're all in God's hands. I mean, whatever we do. And Solomon, sorry, because I don't know if you said Solomon was supposed to, sort of in Orthodox Judaism anyway, have written it, but even if he didn't, it's ascribed to him. At the end of his very wealthy life, he realizes all this, doesn't he? Because, he's no better than anybody else who might be poor in the end of the day.
Okay, great. So I'm going to kind of summarize what you said, and I want to make sure we have it right. So you're noting here that on Sukkot, which is the holiday of our joy, and also, let's say, the transitory holiday, it's the holiday of living in a temporary state, going out into the sukkah. And you're saying all these other customs that we have, focusing on nature, focusing on our guests, there's a sense of not only is the great equalizer death which many have written about Kohelet's perspective. Death is the great equalizer. But maybe we would say Sukkot is a great equalizer. Accepting the temporary nature of life makes us aware that status, wealth, none of that matters. What matters is sort of opening ourselves up to accepting the temporary nature of life and the implications of that. There's a sense of temporary acceptance of the transitory nature of life also allows us to be more accepting and maybe egalitarian oriented, which is really beautiful and interesting. So thank you, Irene, for your thoughts. I saw Abdullah, and then I saw Noreen next, but I also saw Ellie. And Noreen, I'm going to give Ellie a chance just to get Ellie's voice into the room also, and then we may come back to you also. So, and I'll ask at this moment to keep comments brief so that we can look at some texts that may inspire us a little differently than the previous ones. So Abdullah, Nabil, if you can go ahead and unmute, but keep your hands up so we can stay focused on you as the question asker or reflector.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I am from Egypt, and I love to speak to you about this book because it is very important for me personally, because Solomon is very well known for his wisdom and for his wealth and for many things, but unfortunately here we don't see him speaks about it. He speaks about different things. He speaks about depression. He speaks about what is like to be feeling unknown or feeling unworthy of living. It speaks about depression. It speaks about how other people will see life and how everything will go to vain. And that's quite shocking for me, because when I see other books for him, especially when I see books like the Song of Songs and the other books, he is more joyful, and he speaks in a cheerful mood. But here he is very in the opposite, and I kind of sense it. And I have a question for you: why he is acting like that? And why we study such a thing? Because in Sukkot we're supposed to be focusing on the cheerful and happiest memories, and here all we can see is a bad thoughts or a negative way of thinking. On the contrary, on what the other on the people think and feel in their day-to-day life. And I want us to say and to ask about the comparison between the other streams, because in Israel or other Orthodox, they may focus on the Torah or other related books to the Sukkot. So how diverse from Chabad or from Orthodox streams when it comes to celebrate or pray in the Sukkot?
Okay, so first of all, Abdullah, thank you so much for being with us from Egypt. It's very exciting. I don't know how often we have my Jewish learning participants from Egypt, so it's wonderful that you're here. Thank you. I want to speak a little bit to what you said. The last piece, I'm going to just ask you to email me, abby@explorejewish.com. I want to clarify what you're asking. And I think it's a little bit, it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're doing. So I want to be able to answer your question, but I'll ask you to hold on to that and email me. In terms of the writer of Kohelet, as I shared with you earlier, traditionally we do say that King Solomon is the writer. There are different perspectives on that. There are more contemporary perspectives that say that the writer must have been a later writer, later than Solomon, but Kohelet is associated with Solomon. Regardless, one way to respond to your question, Abdullah, is that there is a well-known rabbinic text that says that Solomon wrote different things, and I think actually Irene might have been alluding to this earlier, that Solomon wrote different things at different times in his life. So he wrote Song of Songs about love and sensuality at the beginning of his life when he was young, and then he did get depressed. Goes this passage. He got what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word right now. Yeah, he got a little bit disenchanted with everything that even with his wealth. And he did. It does seem like it. We do hear sort of the voice of someone who sounds depressed. And so the ancient rabbis tell us there was this trajectory. Song of Songs earlier in his life, Proverbs in the middle, and Ecclesiastes, Kohelet at the end when he had gotten depressed. So on the other hand, just a different perspective on that, and whichever one resonates with you is great. When we think about the Hebrew Bible, really, we should be thinking about not one unified work, but as a library of Jewish texts, a library of Hebrew texts, and which is a beautiful way to help us appreciate the great diversity of the different approaches in the Hebrew Bible. One primary theme, if not the primary theme in the whole Hebrew Bible, is covenant and brit, and the people, the Israelite people, the Jewish people's connection to the covenant with God. But we do have this fascinating strand that we call wisdom literature, like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, that focus much more so not on the national experience, but on the individual's experience walking through the world and what the individual can learn about the world around them. So it's a different offering in the Hebrew Bible. And again, when we think about this library of Jewish texts, we have so many different perspectives to speak to us at different times. And in terms of Kohelet being read on Sukkot, Irene suggested earlier the transitory connection. Kohelet is very much about I shared earlier, the fleeting nature of life. Everything is fleeting. And that, in fact, although joy is certainly a theme, a major theme of Sukkot, so is temporariness and transitoriness. And when we put that sukkah up, or when we visit a sukkah, we experience being in the outdoors, in the elements. Even here in New York City, it's beautiful today, but the idea of it getting colder, rainier, putting ourselves out there, really making peace with the temporary nature of protection and of life. Those two things very much connect in the book of Kohelet and the holiday of Sukkot. So what I want to do right now is, I know there are some other questions and I'm excited to hear them, I hope shortly. I want to make sure that we really see as full of a picture as possible of the Kohelet range of texts, the diversity in Kohelet. And I want us to take a look at a little bit more, some of Kohelet's words where Kohelet may be saying, you know what, maybe there are some antidotes to what I'm feeling. So text number 10, 2 are better than 1, says Kohelet. And I want to just focus on verse 10. Kohelet says, if one should fall, the other will lift up his friend. But if the one alone should fall, there is no other to lift him up. Verse 11, if 2 lie together, they are warm. But as for one, how will he be warm? Verse 12, if someone should attack him, the 2 will stand against him. So there are all these ways in which it's better to have a companion, says Kohelet, very famously because of the bird's song that you very well may be familiar with. The beginning of chapter 3 has a beautiful poem that we won't read verse by verse right now, but there is this sense that there's clearly a time for everything. When we weep, that time will pass. When we laugh, that time will pass too. When we embrace, we have a moment of embracing. At some point in our lives, we will probably say, no, thank you. We are not going to embrace right now. There's a time for loving. There's a time for hating. Kohelet seems to be embracing himself. I know that things will pass. When things are difficult or disturbing, they also pass. We're going to keep going a little bit. One really beautiful phrase in Kohelet is matat Elohim, or matat Elohim, a gift of God, verses 12 and 13. And I'll read the JPS translation. Thus, I realized that the only worthwhile thing there is for people to enjoy themselves and to do what is good in their lifetime. And in Hebrew, for the Hebrew speakers here, a very beautiful language. Ki ein tov bam. There's nothing good but ki'im lismoach v'la'asot tov b'chayav. To be joyful and to do good in our lives. Also, whenever a person does eat and drink and get enjoyment out of all their wealth, it is a gift of God. And throughout Kohelet reverts to, if nothing else, the pleasure of eating, the pleasure of drinking, the pleasure of appreciating my hard work and my wealth. Those are things that I can enjoy in the moment. I'll share with everyone here that my father, some people have heard me talk about him, who passed away a couple of years ago. He really lived based on these verses. And I'm sure we all know people in our lives who really appreciate eating and drinking, but not just in the context of a physical pleasure of eating and drinking, but also of thinking of everything in our lives as a gift from God, or even the difficult things. For some people, it's comforting to think about those things as being sent by God. It's a whole other topic, but these refrains, this content of the physical, the here and now of what I can enjoy is something that comes up again and again in Kohelet. Okay, and now we're headed toward the end of the book of Kohelet, and we have a few verses that might strike us as unusual, or might ask us to think more broadly about Hevel. So Kohelet says here in text 13, he compares youth and old age. So can I ask someone to actually go ahead and read verses 8 through 10 for us, and then we'll talk a little bit about Hevel in this context. So the new hands that I saw was Talia. Talia, are you volunteering to read?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So you can go ahead and read in English, and those of us who are Hebrew readers can follow along in Hebrew.
And even if a man lives many years, let him enjoy himself in all of them, remembering how many the days of darkness are going to be. The only future is nothingness, Havel. O youth, enjoy yourself while you are young. Let your heart lead you to enjoyment in the days of your youth. Follow the desires of your heart and the glances of your eyes, but know well that God will call you to account for all such things. And banish care from your mind, and pluck sorrow out of your flesh, for youth and black hair are fleeting. Avail.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Talia. Okay, so we have these verses here. It's in other places, Kohelet does mention youth, but here we can really see that Kohelet says, be sure you enjoy your youth. Your youth is Havel. Usually, Kohelet uses Havel to mean something a little bit more negative. Perhaps he's saying here it's a negative thing. It's very fleeting, obviously, that our youth passes, our not gray hair, whatever color our hair might be, it will eventually change, or we'll lose our hair. Our youth will be gone, and the fleeting nature of youth is Havel. But not only is the fleeting nature of youth Havel, but also he says here, Kol Shabbat Havel, everything that will come, as Alter translates, the only future, or only the future, or the future is only nothingness, or Havel. So just so that we can really think, I want us to think a little carefully about these verses here. It's not only that we should be enjoying our fleeting youth, it's that we cannot predict the future. The future is nothing. Really, Some might say there's no such thing as the future. So what is Kohelet telling us here? Be present in the moment. Whatever, be present in your youth. When the youth passes from each of us, be present with where we are in the moment. And we can't focus on the future. We just have to be with ourselves in the moment, with our breath. This is, again, Alter translates Havel or Havel as breath or mere breath, but really breath, fleeting breath. That might be the best translation. Fleeting breath, presence, those are the things that we know for sure about life. Many things don't make sense, but what do we know? We know that it's crucial, really. If you want to be happy at all, not only enjoy your youth, enjoy every moment that comes after that, because we don't know what the future holds. Be present in every stage and at every age. One more piece here. Okay. So the end of Kohelet that we're about to take a look at together, chapter 12, some people consider an add-on. There are a few I pointed out and I mentioned, there are a couple of places in Kohelet that seem just so contradictory with Kohelet's seeming depressiveness, hopelessness, or not. But there is this sense of, sometimes Kohelet says, oh no, the only answer, we saw a couple examples of that, is to fear God. We know God will reward and punish in the right way, even though maybe we don't experience that. So there is this add-on that we see now that takes the perspectives in Kohelet to a whole new level. So I want us to think about this together. Chapter 12, the final chapter, begins with some verses about death. I gave you a few samples here. You can look at that on your own time. But now let's read what either the editor or Kohelet adds for us here to think about when we think about meaning in our lives, and also in connection to Sukkot. So I'll go ahead and read this. Havel Havalim, fleeting breath, my translation, says Kohelet, all is fleeting breath. And more than being wise, Kohelet further taught knowledge to the people and waited and searched out and framed many maxims. Kohelet sought to find apt words and wrote honestly words of truth. The words of the wise, they are like goads and like nails driven in. They're difficult to take in. From the composers of collections, they are from people who compose them, bring them together, given from a certain shepherd. And more than these, my son, Kohelet speaking here, beware of many books. There is no end. Of making many books, there is no end. And much chatter is the weariness of the flesh. The last word, sof davar hakol nishma, the last word, all being heard, fear God and keep God's commandments, for that is all humankind, or that is the whole duty of man, or that applies to all of mankind. Since every deed God will bring, for every deed, God will bring judgment for every hidden act, be it good or evil. We get this last piece here about just reward and punishment. And that's the last verse. The reason verse 13 is written in italics here, some of you may know, when we read Kohelet on Sukkot at services, which in the diaspora we do Saturday in 2 days. When we read Kohelet, the second to last verse is recited aloud together in order to, as you can say, despite everything that's been said of Kohelet, what's the purpose of all of this, no matter what we've discussed as mere breath, as fleeting, as lacking, as things that we just cannot understand, things that we question about reward and punishment, holding on to our wealth. What is the most important thing? It's not only to be present in every moment, not only that, it's also about aiming higher, aiming for a higher purpose, doing mitzvot, keeping God's word. So now we've gone through today a sampling of texts from Kohelet that are both very difficult, where Kohelet questions everything based on his experience walking through the world, and on the other hand, does share some antidotes to those things, like friendship, experiencing physical pleasure. And toward the end, Kohelet adds these very powerful pieces, poetic pieces about presence and breath and purpose. So now I want to pause here and check in with you. I want to see where you're landing with all of this material together. What do you make of the conflicts, the contradictions? How is perhaps each of the main points landing on you, either these difficult confrontations with life or perhaps the more comforting or inspiring things? So I'm going to start with Ellie and then Noreen, who have had their hands up. So I'll start with you and then we'll see where we land. So Ellie, if you're still with us, you can go ahead and unmute and keep your hands up so we can just see who's speaking.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the concept that I understood and I like is that for starting the new year is wisdom, which requires to examine the ups and downs that we go throughout the year, and before we begin the new year. And there are, things that we have done. We need to think about what we've done right, what we've done wrong. We're all are humans, and we need to understand that we all live in this world that has to be shared with everyone and live it the best possible way in order for other people to, or our descendants and other people to enjoy when we're gone, because everybody will be living and then dying. There's no way around it. So we need to think about what we did to make this world better for future people, the future generations and inhabitants, Earth inhabitants. That's what I gathered from this Kohelet.
Okay, great. So it sounds like you're connecting the content of Kohelet to the larger season that we're in, the high holiday season, which is interesting. I'll share with everyone that I've probably shared before. One of my teachers, who was a teacher of mine in graduate school, who remains a teacher of mine today, is Professor David Kramer, who's a Talmudist and teaches at JTS, at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And he actually taught me that really, rather than thinking of the holidays in this season as separate holidays, it's actually more helpful and meaningful to think about this as one long New Year's festival that starts with examination of our lives, the new year itself, a day of forgiveness, which some suggest should actually be a joyful day because it is a day where we embrace the possibility of forgiveness and starting over. And then really shifting away from the more solemn beginnings of the new year, we get to Sukkot, which is also about taking stock, as Kohelet suggests, as the reading of Kohelet on Sukkot suggests, but it suggests taking stock with joy. So when we look at our own lives and we think about, as Ellie was just suggesting, how do we examine our ups and downs? How do we think about moving forward with more right than wrong? How do we think about living together while we're visiting this earth together? We do that with joy and positivity. It's not only helpful, or not always helpful, to think about ways in which we want to improve with kind of a harsh framing or a difficult framing. We can also think in more positive ways about, and in more light ways and joyful ways about how we are moving forward into this new year. Okay, so Ellie, thank you very much. Noreen, and please correct my pronunciation of your name if needed.
Good. Well, I just wanted to say, I think he struggles with all this, and the fact that he keeps on struggling with it, I think, is a positive thing. And also the fact that really what he ends up with is, okay, so you can't make sense of life in this great cosmic way, but there is purpose and there is satisfaction in everyday life. And you can be with people and share and create, and you can love. And it's not everything that you would like it to be for as long as you would like it to be, but there is a time for everything. And I think that he gives you some tools to accept that. So I think of it in a positive way, even though there's a lot of negativity, but you go through his struggle with him.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we those of us, I don't know, I think we moderns have an easier time maybe embracing, yeah, like we all struggle existentially, or many of us struggle existentially. And Noreen, as you said so beautifully, we may not have everything we want, or we may not live as long as we want, but we can appreciate purpose, satisfaction, creativity, love on a day-to-day basis. Very beautifully said. Thank you so much. So I want to leave everyone with, and you'll see this when you receive the PDF, but I want to leave everyone with, for now, this idea that indeed, I think, sorry about the noise, the fleeting breath that we encounter, the idea of being fully present as much as possible on in Kohelet, we get that in Sukkot also. We get this idea that embracing the temporary, or embracing the transitory, like we do on Sukkot, can allow us to be joyful. So even though it seems like there's a contradiction, reading something that seems primarily dark on Sukkot, perhaps there isn't. Perhaps when we look more closely at Kohelet, we can embrace the idea of Hevel as fleeting breath, and therefore that can encourage us to be present, accepting the temporary nature of our breath. And that we find as symbolized in the Sukkah, the temporary sense that we get when we build a Sukkah and experience the temporary nature of that protection. So I will wish everyone a joyful rest of your Sukkot. And I hope that you'll take some time to go through some of this material on your own. There's rich material in Kohelet. So I wish you joyful learning and a joyful continual entrance into this new year. Chag Sameach and Shabbat Shalom.